Welcome to the Drama Diaries, where a story full of wounds and tears is revealed. When love turns into a burden, when sacrifice is never appreciated, is it still a choice? The sun began to sink behind the hills, leaving an orange tinge in the sky of the village where Ayu lived. He sat on a wooden chair in front of his small rented house, wiping the sweat from his forehead after a day's work. Her eyes wandered to the deserted street, hoping that her husband, Bagas, would come home with good news. Ayu just married Bagas 1 year ago. She is a simple, enthusiastic, and hardworking woman. Before getting married, he imagined a married life full of happiness, sharing roles and building a future together. However, reality says otherwise. Bagas lost his job 3 months after getting married. Initially, Ayu didn't mind. She was sure her husband would wake up soon. However, time went on, and Bagas became more comfortable being unemployed. Instead of trying to find a job, he spent more time at home or going out with friends. The burden of the household that should be borne together is now completely on Ayu's shoulders. He works as an employee at a supermarket in the city, leaving in the morning, coming home at night. But the problem is not only that. Ayu's mother-in-law, Mrs. Wadi, lives with them and is not the type of good mother-in-law. It is a woman's job to serve her husband and family. "You are a wife, don't complain too much," said Mrs. Wati every time Ayu showed fatigue. Every day, Ayu has to ensure that all the house's needs are met, starting from shopping, cooking, paying electricity, to giving money to her in-laws and husband. That night, after coming home from work, Ayu found Bagas still relaxing in the living room, watching television with a relaxed expression, as if there was no burden. On the table, there was only a glass of cold tea, no food for him. Ayu took a deep breath. "Sir, have you looked for work today?" he asked, trying to hold back his irritation. Bagas snorted. "Yes, but it's difficult. Besides, I can't just do anything. I have to do something suitable." Ayu bit her lip, holding back the anger that was already at the edge of her throat. He's tired. Very tired. Suddenly from the room, Mrs. Wadi came out with a sour face. "Come on. Tomorrow I'm going to recitation. Give me money for expenses, okay? Don't be stingy, you're working." Ayu looked down. His eyes were hot, but he couldn't say anything. In this house, she is not a wife, not son-in-law. He is just a money-printing machine for them. Morning had just greeted him, but Ayu was already busy in the kitchen. His hands are deft at preparing a simple breakfast: rice, fried tempeh, and chili sauce. After that, he rushed to clean up the house before going to work. From the room, Mrs. Wadi came out with a sullen face. "It takes so long to cook." "Mother is hungry," he complained as he sat on the dining chair. Ayu could only hold back. "Yes, ma'am, it's ready." He looked towards the room, hoping that Bagas would wake up and accompany him to breakfast before he went to work. But what she heard was the sound of her husband snoring. "Mother, isn't Bagas looking for work today?" Ayu dared to ask. Mrs. Wadi glanced sharply. "Why are you controlling your husband? Bagas is a man, not a slave. Besides, you can still work. Are you embarrassed when your husband is at home?" Ayu's heart sank. No, that's not what it means. He just wants Bagas to have responsibility. But every time he speaks, he gets blamed. Feeling sad, Ayu ate her breakfast quickly. He had to go to work before it was too late. When he was about to leave the house, Mrs. Wadi's voice came back. "Come on, where's the money?" Ayu was silent. Yesterday, he had just given part of his salary to house expenses, and now Mrs. Wadi is asking again. "Ma'am, I've given you money to pay for electricity and shopping. This is just a little for my fare to work." "Ah, just an excuse. Don't you want to help Mom? This mother is your parent too." Mrs. Wadi's voice rose. Bagas finally woke up, walked into the living room while yawning. "Why the fuss so early in the morning? Your wife is stingy. Why don't you give me money if you want to go to the recitation study?" Mrs. Wati complained in an annoying tone. Bagas frowned, then looked at Ayu irritably. Okay, just give me the money. Later, I'll find a way so you can keep going to work. Ayu looked at her husband in disappointment. She hoped that Bagas would defend her, but as usual, her husband preferred his mother. With shaking hands, Ayu took out the last money in her wallet and handed it to Mrs. Wati. After that, without saying anything, Ayu stepped out of the house feeling short of breath. He didn't know anymore how long he would have to survive in conditions like this. Ayu stood at the roadside bus stop, looking at the street which was starting to get busy with people rushing to go to work. Her small hands gripped the bag tightly, while her mind was still filled with the morning's conversation at home. The money in his wallet was completely gone. For the fare to work, he has to walk far enough to be able to take public transportation without having to take transit. That means he will come home later because the return trip is longer. Am I the wife or the breadwinner of the family? He thought bitterly. Arriving at the supermarket where she worked, Ayu tried to divert her thoughts. He greeted customers with a forced smile, handled transactions deftly, even though his head felt heavy. Until finally, during break time, her best friend Rina noticed the change in Ayu's face. Ayu, you look really tired. Have you eaten? Rina asked while handing him the bread. Ayu was silent for a moment, then smiled faintly. Not yet, Rin. It's not appetizing anymore. Rina snorted, then looked at him sharply. Do not lie. This is because I'm at home, right? I've often seen you moody like this. Is your husband still unemployed? Ayu took a deep breath. Yes. Rina looked concerned. Ayu, I know you are a patient person, but this isn't fair. You work hard while your husband and in-laws just give you trouble. How long are you going to be like this? The question pierced Ayu's chest. Until when? He didn't know either. After getting home from work, Ayu had to walk further because she didn't have the money to take a public bus directly home. When he got home, he found a busy atmosphere inside. Several of Bagas's brothers came and chatted in the living room. On the table, there was a lot of delicious-looking food, fried chicken, fried noodles, even some expensive snacks that were rarely found at home. Ayu was stunned. Where is it from? He asked quietly. Mrs. Wati turned around casually. I bought it earlier using the money you gave me this morning, as well as entertaining the family. Ayu's heart seemed to stop beating. The last money he gave with a heavy heart turned out to be used for parties. What's wrong with you, Ayu? Why just keep quiet? Asked one of Bagas's brothers. Ayu pursed her lips tightly. He wanted to be angry, wanted to cry, wanted to scream. But all that came out of his mouth was, "It's okay." Because in this house, his voice was never considered important. That night, Ayu sat in the corner of the room, staring at the ceiling which felt increasingly narrow. His stomach was empty, his body was tired, but his mind was much heavier than everything. Outside, the laughter of the Bagas brothers could still be heard. They enjoyed the food they bought with their last money that was supposed to cover their work expenses tomorrow. Not long after, Bagas entered the room. His face looked relaxed, as if nothing had happened. He sat on the bed, playing with his cell phone without the slightest awareness of his wife, who was silent in pain. Ayu gathered her courage. Sir, I don't have money to go to work tomorrow. Bagas took a quick glance. Yeah, right? Ayu held her breath. I gave my last money to Mother this morning, but I use it to buy food for your siblings. Bagas sighed in annoyance, then put his cell phone away. Okay, ask Mother again. Ayu's chest felt increasingly tight. Sir, that's my hard work money. I'm tired. I work from morning till night. I'm not an ATM machine, sir. Bagas snorted. Yeah, right? Wanna blame Mom? Mom also needs money, Ayu. You are a wife, you should obey. Okay, no need to complain so much. Ayu looked at her husband with watery eyes. This wasn't the first time he felt treated like this, but this time, his heart was truly broken. The night was getting late. Ayu couldn't sleep. He turned over and over in his mind, trying to find a way out of this situation. The next morning, he was determined to go to work without a penny. He walked as far as possible, hoping to catch a public transportation without having to pay more. When he arrived at work, his body was weak. Rina immediately noticed Ayu's pale face. "You didn't eat breakfast, right?" Rina asked with a concerned look. Ayu just smiled faintly. He was too tired to lie. Rina took a deep breath. "Ayu, this can't be allowed. I understand that you love your husband, but if he doesn't change, how long are you going to suffer? Come on, be quiet." Rina's words kept ringing in his head. Until when? How long must he endure a household that only tortures him? She loves Bagas, but does Bagas love her too? Or all this time, he was only seen as a tool to support his family? This question continued to haunt Ayu all day long. And that night, for the first time, he began to think about leaving. That night, Ayu sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor in confused thought. He had never thought about leaving this house before, but today, the thought started to appear in his head. Bagas was beside him, engrossed in his cell phone as usual, as if the world belonged to him alone, without the slightest thought of the burden his wife was carrying. Ayu took a deep breath, trying to speak in a soft voice. "Sir, can we find a solution together? I'm tired of working alone, sir." Bagas frowned, looking at Ayu irritably. "Discussing this again? I told you it's hard for me to get a job. Besides, you can still work, so why bother?" Ayu was silent. Her husband's words felt like a dagger piercing her chest. She bit her lip, holding back tears. "Mas, I'm your wife, not someone who has to carry all the burdens alone." Bagas snorted, then put his cell phone away. "So what do you mean? Are you going to leave me?" Ayu swallowed hard. He didn't want to say it directly, but that was what was on his mind. "I just want us to change, Maz. I want us to live better. I want you to join in the fight, not just me." Bagas stood up, his face turned angry. "So now you blame me? I'm a man, Ayu. If you don't want to accept the situation, that's fine. Just leave." Those words made Ayu freeze. Her eyes felt hot, but she didn't want to cry anymore. Not tonight. She stood up, looking at her husband with mixed feelings. "Are you sure you don't need me?" Bagas was silent, but his pride was too high to admit his mistake. Ayu took a deep breath. He stepped out of the room, towards the kitchen. There Mrs. Wadi was sitting relaxed, drinking tea. "Son, if you leave, don't expect to come back here," said Mrs. Wadi suddenly, as if she already knew what was in Ayu's heart. Ayu looked at the woman's face. All this time, he has tried to be a good son-in-law. But it turns out, no matter how big the sacrifice, he is still considered worthless. He looked around the house he had been living in, a house that was supposed to be a place of refuge, but instead became the most painful place in his life. And at that moment, he made a decision. He will go. Ayu sat in the room, her eyes staring blankly at the wall. The decision to leave was final, but the courage to actually move forward still felt heavy. After this, what will I become? Where are you going? However, if he survives, his life will only become more tormented. In the middle of the night, when the house was quiet, Ayu started packing some clothes into a small bag. He couldn't take many things with him, only what was absolutely necessary. When he was just about to leave the room, the door opened. Bagas stood there, looking at him with a sharp gaze. "Are you really going?" His voice sounded cold. Ayu gripped the strap of her bag tightly. "I'm tired, sir. I can't go on like this." Bagas snorted. So that's all you love me? Ayu smiled sadly. My love is great, Maz. But if I stay here, I'll break down. I've tried, but you never want to change. Bagas was silent. His eyes flashed, but he didn't hold back Ayu. Ayu passed slowly. Her steps felt heavy, but her heart was steady. When she arrived in the living room, Mrs. Wadi sat in a chair with her arms folded across her chest, as if it had been waiting for him. So you want to leave your husband? Want to run away from responsibility? Mrs. Wadi's voice was full of sarcasm. Ayu looked at the woman with eyes full of hurt. Mom, I have done everything for this family, but forever, I will never be considered. Mrs. Wadi snorted. If you leave this house, don't expect to come back again. Ayu smiled faintly. I'm not coming back, ma'am. Without looking back, Ayu stepped out of the house. The night air greeted him coldly, but for the first time in his life, he felt relief. Outside, Rena was waiting for him on the motorbike. You're finally awake, you. Ayu got on the motorbike. When Rena started driving her vehicle, Ayu turned once again to the house. The house that had hurt him, but also taught him one important thing. Love is not enough to sustain a relationship if only one party is struggling. And that night, Ayu chose to fight for herself. 2 years have passed since that night. Ayu is now sitting behind her office desk, wearing a simple blazer which makes her look more dignified. His hands are deft at typing on a laptop, occasionally answering calls from clients. His life now is very different from before. After leaving Bagas's house, he lived temporarily in Rena's boarding house. From there, he began to build his own life, taking job training, looking for a better job, and slowly putting his life back together. Now, he works as an assistant manager at a large retail company. His salary was enough to live comfortably, and most importantly, he no longer lived under pressure. That afternoon, when Ayu was about to go home, someone came up to her outside the office. Bagas. He looked different, thin, his face dull, his clothes not as neat as before. Ayu took a deep breath. He had heard from Rena that Bagas was still unemployed, and that his family's situation had worsened since he left. Ayu. Bagas' voice sounded soft, almost a whisper. Ayu just looked at him without expression.